Your ability to control your thoughts, treat it with respect, it's all that protects your mind from false perceptions, false to your nature and that of all rational beings. It's what makes thoughtfulness possible, and affection for other people, and submission to the divine. End quote. Marcus Aurelius. You're listening to Socratic Smarts.
Here is the point. Here is the point. Here is the point.
Top of volume, we go down on the other side. Pick up it from. And this is the annual reading of the script.
Here is the point. Here is the point.
I went back and I looked. What did I really see? I'm thinking about my sight, and whether this is quite authentic.
Welcome back, listener, to Socratic Smarts. I'm Nomadic J. As always, it's a pleasure to have you back here. Today we're talking about humour, the concept of humour. What is it? Why does it exist? Why do we laugh? Why do we make all these bizarre noises in conversation with one another? And you know, humour is another thing where critics might say it's sorely lacking from this show. A sense of humour or any ability to make a joke is definitely a factor that needs to be improved on, and we'll get there, listener. You know, it's funny, the thing with the solo podcast, I'm still getting used to how I want to do this, you know, the certain style that I try to go with, because the truth is you get no real-time feedback, and that can be an obstacle, or in my case, I guess just something to ignore and just power through, because who knows? I mean, you don't know what lands, you don't know what doesn't, but that's the beauty of humor in some ways. It's that there is this unknown territory of what's okay to joke about, what's not okay to joke about. We're going to look at all of these questions in the next few segments, particularly in the context of Athens, in fact. And we're going to look at a case study with which Socrates was involved, and the playwright in Athens, Aristophanes, we're going to look at one of his plays and how it actually didn't do a lot of good for Socrates. It somewhat ruined his reputation and arguably wasn't very great in terms of giving him the best odds in his trial in the Apology, listener. But before we get there, let's just spend the first segment giving you my lay of the land. I feel like that's always fair if I give you my impression of it. So we're going to be humouring humour today, and to an extent, I think a lot of people have different views on the idea of humour. Some people think that you should be able to joke about anything, and that there's nothing off limits, and that joking is a way of dealing with the darkness of you know, whatever tragedy it is, whatever dire circumstance we find ourselves in, whether it's a tragic accident or someone close to us has passed away, or even something related to us, our physical bodies, that just becomes tragic. We're now suffering from some debilitating illness, or we've been told we have 6 months to live, whatever it is. There are many ways in which we can be completely oppressed by the darkness and tragedies of our lives. And some people feel as if joking and laughing and using comedy as a way to tackle that could be one potential antidote. And on the other spectrum, or I should say on the other side of this spectrum, we have people that think humor and making jokes or just being silly about these darker arts, people think that this is not really acceptable. You know, you have people that think you should be serious or always, you know, sincere, and never should you crack a smile when someone is, you know, joking from their deathbed. You should always be like, no, you should be focused on the fact that you're going to die. You know, they don't allow that sort of humor in those serious, darker contexts, you might say. And I want to explore this whole spectrum. I'm not going to put forth any particular opinion. This is not the point of this show, but I want to explore all these different viewpoints of how should we approach humor? What is the moral dimension of humor? Is there something in humor that we can all learn from to enjoy, you might say, the banalities of life a little more? Because joking is a way to deal with the humdrum day-to-day trivialities of life, you might say. But on this deeper level, I want to get to this concept that we'll explore a lot more, I think, in the third segment of the show. And it's this idea that we could potentially take humor, listener, down to the, you might say, the existential level. You know, if you go back to episode 2 when we talked about the idea of nihilism. Humor is actually a great antidote to this feeling that nothing matters, you know? If you're taking life so seriously and you're taking all of your shortcomings and all of your perceived failures, all your negative emotion, if you take all of that so seriously that you can't escape from it, that it's real to the existential degree that you feel it's real, then you're unable to take an ironic approach, you might say. You're unable to come at that problem or that thought or that emotion with a different vantage, with a approach of, well, it's not so serious in the end, because another way to approach the feeling of nihilism that nothing matters because Earth is just some unremarkable planet amongst hundreds of billions of other unremarkable planets in a galaxy full of unremarkable stars. There is a way of framing that whole situation as a sort of nihilistic tragedy. But when we use humor and irony, we could say, well, maybe I stubbed my toe today and that ruined my morning, but nothing matters in the end. There are galaxies and stars that are blowing up every second of every moment, so nothing really matters. So therefore, the fact that I missed my train and now I'm late to work, that doesn't really matter because nothing matters. There's a way of reframing that if nothing matters, as the nihilist likes to shout from the cliffs, that argument also doesn't matter, and so we shouldn't feel all of the negative, passive, oppressive feelings that those thoughts typically come with. Before we immerse ourselves in that idea a little bit more, I'll give you a little preview of what's to come. Here is Diana Winston, who is a mindfulness education specialist at the UCLA. She says on the concept of humor, quote, "An ability to be mindful and aware allows us to handle whatever life brings with aplomb, equanimity, and even a sense of humor about things. It is a tool for accessing our inherent goodness, and doing so reminds us that, deep down, we know we can handle life. Understanding that we have access to natural awareness shows us that even when life's problems seem insurmountable, we will get through them somehow." End quote. And Winston's approach here definitely comes out of mindfulness and a form of meditative practice. Am I saying that you need to hang up a dream catcher in your house, listener, in order to have a sense of humor? Absolutely not. But what I am saying is, if thoughts and negative emotion prevent you from, you might say, laughing at the fact when you stub your toe, right? When you stub your toe, is it funny? Well, maybe it's not to you, at least not immediately. It might be funny, 10 seconds from then when you laugh at how seriously you took all that pain and all the, curses that you might have let slip out in those moments. But is it funny to the person who saw you stub your toe? Is it funny to a stranger? Is it funny to your best friend? Answer is probably yes. And also, I'll give you a great example. Here's my life, right? I went jogging yesterday morning, for the first time in a while, I should admit and be totally honest about. It was the first time in about maybe a fortnight I'd seriously gone out and tried to do some cardio, and it was raining and muddy and wet. Early morning dew was setting in, and I had just slipped, and luckily I didn't hurt myself. It was on concrete, but I just sort of slipped in this puddle, and then my legs were just covered in mud. And it was just as this neighbor from across the street was coming out of their house and saw me fall over, and they just started laughing, and then I just started laughing, and it became this very just funny moment. And for a moment it was like, oh, am I hurt? Is everything okay? There was a moment of just assessment where one has to consider their surroundings, and potentially there was some embarrassment that was setting in. But once there was just laughter, and especially from my point of view, it just became funny. With dirty knees and dirty hands, just finish the jog. And there is a way in which I like that metaphor for just handling things in life. It's all right to fall in the mud. It's all right to have an embarrassing moment where people laugh at you, but the idea that you should feel shame, or you should take every embarrassing moment as something to think about endlessly. If mindfulness and meditation has any role in this conversation, it's to understand that, thoughts are not real. And so if you're able to take your thoughts in a way that isn't so serious, if you're able to think in a way that is a bit more silly, then humor is an antidote not only to solving the problem of I'm dealing with too much negative emotion, or my thoughts are too intense or too quick and I can't stop them and I'm stuck in this whirlwind of happenings, right? But it's also important to take it less seriously than that, and also just use it as a tool for just joking around and talking with people. And there's so many layers to humor. There's, as we said at the start, a spectrum to how many people see it, and there are all these different arguments for whether or not it is a good or bad thing in certain circumstances. And we're going to explore all of these multifaceted questions in the show, listener. So stay tuned for the next segment. We'll see you then. Welcome back, listener, to Socratic Smarts. In this segment of the show, we're looking at humour still. Going to keep exploring this idea. And a good place to start would be laughter, this thing that primates such as ourselves do. It's very interesting to look at laughter from, you might say, the perspective of a social psychologist, what's going on, or perhaps of an evolutionary psychologist, what is the fitness value of laughter? Why would laughter evolve as a social emotion? What advantages does it give us, right? It's a very different landscapes to look at the concept of laughter. And Kevin Simler and Robin Hanson sort of take this approach in their book, The Elephant in the Brain. Here is their explanation of some of the mysteries of laughter. They say, quote, "Laughter, chuckles, chortles, giggles is an innate and universal behavior. We start laughing almost as soon as we're out of the womb, months before we learn to talk or sing. Even infants born blind and deaf who can't copy behaviors from their parents or siblings instinctually know how to laugh. And while each culture develops its own distinct language and singing style, laughter sounds pretty much the same in every remote village and bursting metropolis on the planet. As they say, it needs no translation. Laughter is an involuntary behavior. It's not something we actively decide to do. Our brains simply do it naturally and spontaneously. In this way, laughter is similar to other involuntary behaviors, like breathing, blinking, flinching, hiccuping, shivering, and vomiting. But whereas these are merely physiological, laughter is an involuntary social behavior. It's a response to social cues, laced with interpersonal significance, yet, quote-unquote, we, the conscious, deliberate, willful parts of our brains, don't get to decide when we do it. End quote. If laughter is an involuntary response, then why do some of us think that we should police it? Like, why do some of us think that there are certain things that we can't joke about and certain things that we can joke about? This is one thing I think is worth thinking about, because it seems to me that when we laugh at something, the whole point of laughing at a joke is to kind of expose that you were assuming something that you didn't know, or that you were taking something seriously when you shouldn't have. That's the whole premise of a laugh, is that it's this involuntary thing that comes out of you. It's not something you decided to laugh at. And so, in the days of cancel culture, you might say, in the days of, this modern age of social connectivity online that we find ourselves in, perhaps it's worth remembering that a lot of us don't choose what we find to be funny. We just find it to be funny. And so this idea that we could ever police the realm of humor such that we can tell people what they're allowed to laugh at and what they're not allowed to laugh at, what they're allowed to joke about, and what, topics they're banned from ever being frivolous in any way. This seems to be a bit of a weird thing to do. And, comedy is so entrenched in the society. It's a public good. It serves this sort of tension release purpose. And this goes back to Athens, because in the days of Athens, comedy was very valued. In fact, they had these awards. The prizes that were given to the best comedies actually had double the amount of submissions than the tragedies. And Athens really understood this dichotomy, or at least that's how we understand it looking back, is this tension between comedy and tragedy. When I fell over in the puddle, it could have been tragic. It could have been this moment of embarrassment. But if you take the comedic perspective, if you take that other view, then maybe it's not so bad. And I think this idea that they're related in some way, that they interdefine each other, tragedy and comedy, goes back very, very far to the days of Socrates. In his Introduction to Classical Athens, City of Socrates, J.W. Roberts says on the context of Athenian comedy and how we understand it today through the view of Aristophanes, he says, quote, "The surviving 5th century plays of Aristophanes are most of what remains of what is called Old Comedy. That comedy, different from all later comedy, is best understood by contrast with tragedy. Some huge contrasts are obvious. Though mythological plots were known, the surviving Aristophanic plots are all topical, and their leading characters are not great men in decline, but more often little men in the ascendant. Aristotle describes the characters in tragedy as spodeos, or serious. The characters in comedy are phalos, or ordinary, insignificant, or inferior. The spodeos man is concerned about his honor. The phalos man is not wicked, but lacks the resources to pursue honor. Tragedy is concerned with good men faring unexpectedly ill, comedy with insignificant men faring unexpectedly well. The public importance of comedy had been recognized since 486, when a prize was instituted for the best comedy at the city Dionysa." End quote. Clearly we get this idea that there's a public value for comedy. There's something useful with respect to the public needing a sort of stress release valve to deal with the tension of the time. You got to understand, this is a city that is regularly plagued by war. You know, though Athens was the cultural capital and did have all these great things going for it. It was on the coast and had all these great spices, and the agora, the marketplace, right, was renowned for that too. We had these high levels of philosophical debate and politics going on. This is still by today's standards, a civilization that is quite awful to live in and don't have these general moral concerns of every human has a right to exist and we all have a right to basic needs and water and all these things, the basic technologies we take for granted today, having a washing machine or like whatever it is, just a shower, just any functional toilet, any plumbing of any kind. These were not available to everyone at all moments, especially if you're in the lower rungs of society. I think they even had public toilets, so that must be fun, in the open. No stalls, just sort of staring each other down. That must be quite enjoyable. But I don't know the fine details of their toiletry capacities. But generally speaking, our lives today are pretty great when you compare it to theirs. And with respect to Socrates, this was a factor in his life. There is an idea that maybe, though we can joke about certain things, what is the difference between a sincere joke where we understand that the point, maybe we're making fun and someone is the butt of the joke. In essence, we understand that we're trying to make a joke, and that comes with a inherent silliness. Once it becomes sincere or hateful, then it's no longer a joke. That's by definition. But that's a hard thing to figure out, isn't it, listener? Like, go back to the episode on rhetoric. There's kind of a lot of harmony here, because just in the same way we don't know when someone's being sincere with their use of rhetoric, you don't know when someone's being sincere when they're telling a joke, and there is such a thing as a bad joke and jokes that they don't have any good intention behind them. And Socrates was very much the victim of this when Aristophanes portrayed his play called Clouds to the Athenians, where he portrays Socrates as being, in the play, quite a kind of like a witchcraft, alchemist, crazy person. The modern version of this today might be some yoga mum that has crystals in every room of her house or something, who reads a lot of Deepak Chopra. I don't know, or whatever, take your pick. But someone who is obsessed with a lot of things, but really doesn't deliver any wisdom. And he's also portrayed as being kind of a sophist, right? Like what we explored in the last episode, the idea that you can make the worse argument the stronger just by virtue of language, and you can convince people of things which aren't necessarily true or good just by virtue of having a mastery of language. So we go back to Roberts as he introduces this tension that Socrates now has to deal with. He says, quote, "Certainly his next surviving play, Clouds, produced at the city Dionysa in 423, was placed third out of 3 or perhaps 5. Since we have neither the original version of Clouds nor the rival plays, we cannot explain this, but it was a bitter disappointment to Aristophanes. To Greek ways of thinking, winners came first, the rest almost nowhere. The play is named after its chorus, who are among the unconventional deities worshipped by Socrates. End quote. So the play is named after Clouds, these sort of gods that are worshipped by Socrates, and they're not the Greek gods, so you can imagine he's sort of being suggested here that Socrates worships false gods. He worships, his own crazy incarnations, as opposed to the traditional, good gods that teach you virtue that you're supposed to follow, like Zeus and etc., etc. And the play, just to give you a little summary, this is like the footnotes version, but you need to understand it just to get a general idea of how Socrates was represented. In the play, there's a father and son, and they have this farm, and they need to go into debt in order to keep their land and keep the farm operational, keep their work going. And the father wants to make the worst argument the stronger. He wants to be able to have that skill because he hears Socrates has it. And so he wants to encourage his son to go, and he's kind of beating his son around. He's really trying to get him to go to this thinkery, which is run by Socrates. And the son doesn't want to go, so he goes himself. He doesn't have much luck, and Socrates doesn't consider him a very good student, and so he comes back. But then the son ends up going, and he's a great student, and Socrates does teach him how to make the worse argument the stronger, does teach him the intricacies of rhetoric and how to play with language in such a way to convince the debt collectors when they come to basically not be able to collect their debt. He plays with the contract, the law, the way that it's worded. He plays with it and says, well, you can't come. It's something about how there's two moons, the old moon and the new moon. You're trying to make one day into two, and therefore you can't collect the money today. And so this makes the debt collectors very angry, but the father loves it, of course, and now he loves his son and thinks that it's great that he has this ability. But then it turns, as the plays often do, there's a twist, and the son starts employing this rhetorical sophistry to beat his own father. So he says, I don't see any reason why I shouldn't be able to fight you, because you're beating me. And if according to my argument, there's nothing wrong with me fighting back. And he becomes very rebellious, and he sort of loses all of his traditional virtue and upbringing. And the father, in retaliation to this, goes to the thinkery and burns it down. And that is the very, very brief summary. And Socrates is really portrayed, you might say, in this, evil guy, isn't he? Corrupting the youth, as he was accused of in his trial and the apology. But Roberts comments that Aristophanes' portrayal here might have been quite inaccurate. He says, quote, his portrait of Socrates is barely coherent. It represents him as both absurd and dangerous, as both ungodly scientific researcher and dishonest teacher of rhetoric. As we shall see, there is no good reason to suppose that the real Socrates pursued scientific research or taught rhetoric. Aristophanes attributes to him traits which were quite alien to him, and which the poet surely knew were alien to him. On the other hand, the audience of Clouds will for the most part not have known which traits were alien and which were not. In Apology, Plato makes Socrates say that the jurors have seen Clouds, with its portrait of Socrates who claimed to walk on air. Other comic poets, too, had contributed to the prevailing misrepresentation. It is reasonable to suppose that comedy in general, and Clouds in particular, although it came third, did damage to the reputation of Socrates and contributed to his conviction in 399. It is no less hard to guess what, if anything, Aristophanes should be done about the real Socrates. It might be said that his concern in Clouds was not so much to portray or attack the real Socrates as to draw attention to the threat posed by teaching like his to many of the best features of Athenian life. The original audience may possibly have mistaken a covert warning for an endorsement. End quote. Roberts is making the very important point that I think I sort of hinted at with the beginning, that there is a spectrum here. And I understand the argument that it's hard to tell when something's a joke, especially if it's done in a mean-spirited way. And you could almost say that Aristophanes, though he might not have wanted Socrates to be misrepresented in this way and to sort of contribute to the public image of him being this narcissistic fool that eventually got him into trouble in his trial. And as Roberts mentioned there, Socrates mentions in the Apology through Plato's writing that this is how he's known, and he has to basically walk back the public from this image that they have of him, that they've seen in clouds, that they've seen in this very popular play by this one of the most famous playwrights in Athens. Of course, they're going to rely on him, and they get this version of Socrates, this character of Socrates in their heads, and maybe there is a real tension between, I don't know, defamation and joking. I mean, what's the difference there? That's something worth thinking about. I think in general as well, we got to consider that maybe joking can sometimes be used, or saying, oh, it's just a joke, bro. Many people might say that as a cover to say truly hateful or sincerely malevolent things. And we also have to be sensitive to that. The weird problem with that is that we can't allow, just because some people might use that in a very cynical way, we can't allow that to prevent us from actually joking sincerely and actually being silly. And we can't let that tension undermine our ability to joke about anything, because that seems to be not a desirable outcome either. So that's where we're going to leave the second segment. In the third segment, we're going to get to this deeper layer of existential humor that I hinted at in the first part of the show. So stay tuned. We'll see you then.
Then if it is, then if it is,
Luminous experience. Living forms that are nevertheless absolute. Luminous experience. Living forms that are nevertheless absolute. Luminous experience. Living forms that are nevertheless absolute.
then if it is,
Luminous experience. Luminous experience.
Then if it is, what about the nothingness that was before you started?
Welcome back, listener, to Socraticsmarts. In the last segment of the show, we're looking at humor, having a sense of humor. What does it mean to have the skill of humor? You know, we have this thing called comedians, stand-up comedians. We pay them because apparently they communicate something about life through the vehicle of humor that we consider is, I don't know, meaningful. It touches us on some way, I guess you could say. And I promised in the final segment of the show a way to approach humor on perhaps the existential level. So maybe we could not just see humor as something to just, tell dirty jokes or potty mouth humor. We could actually use it as a way to maybe even, you might say, soften your psychology, soften your negative emotion, allow yourself to take more risks because you're less afraid of all the negative things that might happen. Instead of me just giving a poor explanation of this idea, let's go to a previous person on this show we've mentioned. Let's go to Seneca. Seneca is, of course, if you forgot, he's one of the Roman philosophers, the Stoic Romans, alongside Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, and he served under Nero, the Roman emperor, and he actually killed himself under his rule. He was ordered to after being suspected of being in a coup, or if it's a conspiracy, if you take that approach, maybe he was set up, who knows. But he has this letter to his friend Lucius. A lot of Seneca's writings come in this letter form to his friend, and this one is on facing hardships, and I feel like it captures this idea of kind of existential irony. And so we're just going to read this whole letter, I think, because it's not too long and it captures most of the idea. So here is Seneca on the idea of having humor even in the face of huge and insurmountable hardships. He says, quote, "Spite of all, do you still chafe and complain, not understanding that in all the evils to which you refer, there is really only one, the fact that you do chafe and complain. If you ask me, I think that for a man there is no misery unless there be something in the universe which he thinks miserable. I shall not endure myself on that day when I find anything unendurable. I am ill, but that is part of my lot. My slaves have fallen sick, my income has gone off, my house is rickety, and I have been assailed by losses, accidents, toil, and fear. This is a common thing. Nay, that was an understatement. It is an inevitable thing. Such affairs come by order, and not by accident. If you will believe me, it is my inmost emotions that I am now just disclosing to you. When everything seems to go hard and uphill, I have trained myself not merely to obey God, but to agree with his decisions. I follow him because my soul wills it, and not because I must. Nothing will ever happen to me that I shall receive with ill humour or with a wry face. I shall pay up all my taxes willingly. Now, all the things which cause me to groan or recoil are part of the tax of life, things, my dear Lucius, which you should never hope and never seek to escape. It was disease of the bladder that made you apprehensive. Downcast letters came from you. You were continually getting worse. I will touch the truth more closely and say that you feared for your life. But come, did you not know that when you prayed for a long life, that this is what you were praying for? A long life includes all these troubles, just as a long journey includes dust and mud and rain. But you cry, I wish to live, and at the same time be immune from all ills. Consider in what attitude you shall receive this prayer of mine. I offer it not only in good, but in a noble spirit. May gods and goddesses alike forbid that fortune keep you in luxury. Ask yourself, voluntarily, which you would choose if some god gave you the choice. A life in a cafe, or a life in a camp. And yet, life, Lucius, is really a battle. For this reason, those who are tossed about at sea, who proceed uphill and downhill over toilsome crags and heights, who go on campaigns that bring the greatest danger, are heroes and front-rank fighters. But persons who live in rotten luxury and ease while others toil are mere turtle doves, safe only because men despise them. Farewell. End quote. And so Seneca's final point there to me rings the strongest. I mean, it's the fact that we even have the ability to be upset, that the train was late, that we stubbed our toes. It's the indulgence about the fact that we even have a right to be upset about that. Because as Seneca says in that final passage, life is a battle, and if you've forgotten that, then life will remind you. It will remind you with every next experience of what you perceive as suffering or challenge or a problem. That's what life is. And the men who are in the trenches, right, who are fighting these wars, who are actually doing the hard work, that is a genuine thing for that society to notice. And Seneca's saying, look, the only reason why you think you have hardships just because you lost your fortune or just because you have some illness, well, you just forgot the fact that life is that, and the fact that you want more of life. You might say things like, well, I wish I lived a little longer, I wish I had more time. Seneca is also pointing out in this essay, as he says, that is a kind of weird thing to say. And he also claims there that he doesn't think anything should be unendurable or any experience should be not met with a sly smile, right? He says, I'm going to approach every problem or hardship with a slight smile, knowing that, well, this is just my lot and this is what I've been given, and what I make of it in terms of how I approach this problem. That's going to really define it. It's not going to get stuck in it just because I'm so overwhelmed by the tragedy of what I've been given. Seneca's saying, look, if the most experienced, the most tough, courageous people understand this about life. They actually get this at a fundamental level, which is why you might say in the military or in battle conditions, soldiers develop very dark senses of humor. And that's why you have all these videos that the public can't interpret. You can think of recent examples in the Middle East where you had videos of Allied troops, urinating on enemy combatants, things like this, where they develop a very rigid and dark sense of humor that to the public looks almost like sadistic and weird. And that is because humor becomes this defense mechanism for them that we don't really, as just normal civilians, can actually see at the end of the day. But we don't need all the hardship of war just to develop a healthy sense of humor about life. We can actually do this even in the midst of privileged, cushioned civilization. And insofar as this episode has communicated any of that wisdom from that era in history, but I think that'll just about do it for today's episode, listener. If you have enjoyed the show and you have some feedback to give, as I've mentioned, hit me up at socraticsmarts@gmail.com, and that'll do it. So have a good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you're at, whatever's cooking in your kitchen. and we'll see you next time.
Here is the part. Here is the part.
Chop the volume and go down on the other side. Pick up it again. And this is the annual reading of the script.
Here is the part. Here is the part.
I went back and I looked. What did I really see? I'm thinking about my sight and whether this is quite authentic.